The 1st Battalion of the United States 7th Cavalry prepares itself for battle in Vietnam. The orders are simple: find the enemy and destroy them. History haunts this unit. Nearly a century ago, the 7th Cavalry, led by George Armstrong Custer, was massacred by the Sioux. No one imagined that on this November day in 1965, these young soldiers, like Custer's 7th, would be surrounded by an indigenous enemy intent on their destruction. For the 7th Cavalry, rotors had replaced hooves. These modern-day cavalrymen rode into battle aboard a machine made infamous by Vietnam, the helicopter. For the American Army, everything moved by helicopter. And one ship, more than any other, shouldered the load. Bell Helicopter's Huey. In the early 1960s, the United States Army set out to wage a new kind of warfare based on the concept of air mobility. For thousands of years, soldiers had been enslaved by terrain. With the helicopter, infantry attack moved into the 3rd dimension. Troops could strike at the heart of the enemy with unimaginable speed. Air mobility would revolutionize the way armies fought and would make the helicopter an integral part of the war. In the central highlands of Vietnam, in a distant place known as the Nha Trang Valley, air mobility faced its first test.
You're flying the helicopters and the infantry into a landing zone almost 15 miles from the nearest road, and they're out there to stay. They're going to fight. They're going to be supplied by the helicopter. They're going to use artillery support that has been jumped out there by a helicopter. This is the graduation ceremony. This is either it's going to work or we're all going to die out there.
This helicopter's official name is the UH-1 Iroquois. From early on, crews took those initials and dubbed it the Huey. The nickname stuck. This single-rotor machine, designed by Bell, was the first turbine-engined helicopter to fly into combat. The aircraft was designed to fit the Army's need for a faster and more powerful chopper.
The Huey was relatively untested against small arms fire and automatic weapons, and certainly against anti-aircraft weapons. And so no one knew how that would come out in a combat situation.
Vietnam was the first helicopter war. At one point, there were more American helicopters in Vietnam than any other country even owned. The Huey came to symbolize the struggle. This rugged machine served as jeep, truck, and ambulance. The UH-1 was also the world's first dedicated attack helicopter. On countless occasions, the cavalry looked to this aerial gunship for salvation. With vicious rocket pods, machine guns mounted on the sides, and a grenade launcher in the nose, it carried more firepower than the typical World War II fighter.
Okay, we got one on the run. Don't shoot him. I want to force him down. We've got him running again, people. You see that? There's somebody right in that straw. You're right, there's somebody right at the end of that straw pile there.
Before November 1965, the Americans chased the elusive guerrillas of the Viet Cong. Except for a few chance encounters, Americans had yet to fight the well-trained, highly dedicated troops of the North Vietnamese Army. So the 1st Cavalry was given free rein by Commanding General William Westmoreland to conduct the now infamous search and destroy missions. Reports indicated sizable enemy movement into South Vietnam near the Cambodian border. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, the Americans flew to a landing zone in the Ya Drang Valley known as LZ X-ray.
I picked X-ray because it was the one clearing in the area of operations which I had been assigned, which could take the most helicopters. And I wanted to get as many men on the ground as possible, as soon as possible, and as many on the first lift as I could bring in.
At dawn, Huey crews began the first of many missions on a day none of them would forget. Moore and his officers flew a reconnaissance mission over LZ X-ray. Just after 10 o'clock, artillery from 2 nearby fire bases opened up and pounded the perimeter. The goal was to soften up the area for the incoming grunts. As the barrage lifted, ARA or aerial rocket artillery Hueys laced the LZ with rockets and machine guns. Once their work had finished, helicopter gunships fired on the LZ while they escorted arriving troop carriers.
17 search green, all Limazotos green, everybody in, over.
At 10:48 a.m., the first of some 450 U.S. troopers jumped into landing zone X-ray, unaware of the odds against their survival.
And I had the feeling that we were going to get into a fight in that area. And we captured a prisoner within 25 minutes who was unarmed and had an empty canteen. And he was obviously an outpost. And he told us through an interpreter that there were 3 battalions of enemy, of Vietnamese army forces on that mountain and wanted very much to kill Americans, but hadn't been able to find any.
In places like Ya Drang, helicopters took hostile fire daily. That's the main reason for the inclusion of the M60 machine gun, double-mounted on either side of the Huey.
60 that we use were basically the infantry type, and we take the 60, roll it upside down, and use your little finger to actually operate the trigger, and you just work it like this. And in order to stop that from falling out of the aircraft, we had bungee cords. So if you did get shot, or the pilot had to make a maneuver that you wouldn't lose the 60, it wouldn't fall out of the aircraft.
American chopper crews flew more than 30 million missions over Southeast Asia. This intensity forged a bond between the enlisted man and the officer to a degree not normally found.
The aircraft commander was assigned to the aircraft. It was his aircraft. He knew that, everybody knew that. The crew chief knew it was really the crew chief's aircraft. But we humored the aircraft commanders. The crew chief had the responsibility for the logbook on the aircraft. Both the crew chief and the aircraft commander did a pre-flight check every day. Looked at different things sometimes. A lot of times we didn't tell the aircraft commander everything that we were looking at. We figured he had enough on his mind flying the thing. We didn't want any distractions.
In Vietnam, the helicopter crews earned a reputation for performing daring antics, regardless of the hazards.
Army aviators they're a special breed of madman. They came when called, you know, they were God's lunatics, I guess you'd have to say. They just didn't know any better or didn't care.
I loved doing what I did. And all of the guys I flew with, whether they were pilots or crew chiefs or gunners, were there because they wanted to be there. Went out every morning ready to go. If we didn't want to fly, all we had to say was, I don't want to fly.
For those who relied on the Huey, the aircraft became more than a means of transport. For those who flew it, like Bruce Crandall, there was a chilling irony to the mission.
A PFC explained it all to me one day. He says, I love you sometimes, but I hate you sometimes too, because we get in contact and we know that you guys are there and you're going to take us out. If we get wounded, you'll take us out. You bring us food and you bring us our supplies that we need. And I love you when you're doing that, but then we win the fight and you guys pick us up and take us someplace else and put us back into trouble.
Thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers had spent months moving down into the Central Highlands. Their aim was to split South Vietnam in two. The Americans were aware of their presence, though they didn't yet know of their exact strength or location. On November the 14th, 1965, the men of the 7th Cavalry set out to find the Viet Cong. The majority of the soldiers expected this to be another routine search and destroy mission, though in reality, the routine had been more search than destroy.
When we landed at X-Ray, it was fairly calm at the beginning, and then it wasn't long, just a few minutes, 15 minutes like that. We headed into the creek bed area towards the mountain, and we came under attack. A very vicious, fierce attack. And all around me, in front of me, there must have been about 6 or 8 guys that got chopped down immediately.
North Vietnamese soldiers swooped down from a base camp on a nearby mountain to attack the cavalrymen. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 5 to 1.
At the very outset, when we were being struck so savagely, I thought, man alive. And I'm the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry, direct lineage from George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry Regiment at the Little Bighorn in Montana in June of 1876. And it fleetingly crossed my mind that by God, I wouldn't let happen to us what happened to Custer and his men at the Little Bighorn.
Combat is thrilling for a young trooper, you know, a young grunt, 20, 22 years old. I guess it's your adrenaline kicks in, but it's extremely thrilling. I mean, not that it's enjoyable, it's just the fear and the shock value of it all. What spoils that thrill of excitement in combat is the horror, the ugliness of war, especially when you see your own. You know, their guts are out on the ground, and their arms are mangled, and their legs are blowed up, and even the enemy, you know, it's pitiful. You know, everybody dies a horrible death in combat.
With the Americans surrounded, casualties quickly mounted. For those critically wounded, their only hope lay in a swift evacuation. The Huey and its onboard medics meant that field hospitals and ample blood supplies were usually just minutes away.
You had normally a 3-liter configuration, which you used up against the transmission wall or where you secured. The problem is when you went into a hot LZ, there was no time for that kind of stuff. So what would happen is, as soon as you hit the ground, the medic and the crew chief would load the patients in, and depending on how many of them there were, put them wherever you could in here. You just laid them wherever you could on the floor so that you could get out of there as fast as you could. Once you had all of them loaded in the back and you took off, then the medic and the crew chief at altitude would start sorting out who was the priority to start to treat first and tell us located up front as to what the condition of these patients were and what kind of hospital we needed to get them to.
By the end of the war, medevacs, also known as dust-offs, would haul nearly 400,000 wounded to safety.
You can get at them assholes now.
At LZ X-ray, heavy enemy fire strafed the landing zone. Cavalry medevacs were prohibited from touching down in a hazardous LZ, and so had to abort. Instead, the pilots and crews of the assault forces hauled out their own wounded and dead. Those flying into X-ray had a clear view of the battle raging beneath them. On his 5th drop of the day, Bruce Crandall watched helplessly as enemy soldiers penetrated the landing zone.
He was there, and there was nothing I could do about it. As I touched down, he came up and started firing and shooting at people, and he killed the radio operator sitting in the center of the helicopter. Got my crew chief in the throat. When I came out of there, I had 3 dead and 3 wounded on the aircraft.
Our aircraft was severely damaged. We couldn't fly it anymore, so we switched to a new one and got that up. And we knew we'd have to go back in. Since our unit, as a bunch of as pilots, had never been under that kind of direct intensity and heavy volume of fire. It was not only our aircraft hit, almost all of our 8 aircraft that went in, we had 6 of them that were damaged.
At the beginning of hostilities, the Vietnamese were terrified of the helicopter and the weapons it carried, and with good reason. The M60 machine gun fired at a rate of 550 rounds per minute. Hueys flying at treetop level wrought havoc on those below. The aircraft's ability to strike quickly and with precision caused untold deaths. Civilians suffered as much as the soldier. But the Viet Cong began learning to counter the helicopter. The hunter had at last become the hunted.
They learned if you stood your ground and fought back, you could make things come out your way. They learned how to lead a helicopter like you lead a duck or a covey of quail when you're bird hunting. And they did a whole lot of training. It was very crude, and it didn't always work, but they got better at it. They were endlessly adaptable, the VC.
This chart had been tacked to a tree, and what the VC were doing that day was holding class on how to shoot down American helicopters. This up here in Vietnamese says gun sight, where to aim to shoot down helicopters. This is the gun sight here, and you can notice the aircraft way back here, and you can see the writing, and then this little writing in red with the number 5, which basically says when the aircraft is straight and level, leading by about 5 helicopter lengths. This one shows you if you're doing a normal takeoff. In other words, when a helicopter takes off, Very rarely does it come straight up. It normally accelerates forward and climbs. So you'll notice the gun sight is located in front and above the helicopter so as to allow you to fly again into his line of fire. When we landed to have the wounded picked up, I guess as a thank you for getting them, this was given to me by the people on the ground.
More than 4,800 helicopter crewmen were killed, while over 2,000 Hueys were lost to hostile fire in Southeast Asia. Countless others were damaged, but made it home, testimony to the craft's resilience.
In combat, the aircraft could take 20 or 30 rounds and continue to fly because no critical part was hit. For example, it could go through here and straight through the other side and never affect any component that was necessary for flight. It's really between you and the gods. If luck is on your side today and one round didn't hit one very important component, yes, you'd be okay.
As a measure of protection, the crews in Vietnam were issued body armor, known as the chicken plate.
It's heavy, it's hot, it's uncomfortable to wear. I used it to sit on. I always thought it was a macho type thing, but not to wear it, but I always thought chances of a round coming straight at you is not going to be all that great, because that'd be like an air-to-air type fight. Most of the people shooting at you are going to be shooting from the ground up, so I'd rather have my bottom side covered where the rounds are coming through the bottom of the aircraft. Now, I would put it on every now and then when we go into a hot LZ.
Looking at an LZ with the tracers bouncing off the ground and bouncing off trees and realizing we're about to go in there, decide that you're dead. That's it. If I go in there, I'm not coming out. But let's go. Once you make that decision, you accept that. You continue to operate. But it changes you.
Just past noon on the first day, LZ X-ray was shut down. With enemy soldiers in the landing zone, Hal Moore could not risk losing any more helicopters.
All the airplanes left the area, Yellowwood. 6-8, 6-8. In the process of getting out of the way right now, over.
The crews were forced to return to base, knowing that at some point they would have to go back.
The worst part mentally was the waiting. When you're sitting around waiting, you got a lot of time to think. You got to have an awful lot of time on your hands to think. It seemed like it just took an eternity to sometimes to get back off and go to this place where, well, you weren't really sure you're going to come back out alive.
Huey pilot Lee Comich was just 25 years old when he flew into X-ray. This film of him was taken by fellow pilot John Mills.
When we sat and then got ready, it was like, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to go back in or whatever? So we called for volunteers to go with us. We never knew what really would show up at that time when the call came. So when Colonel Moore called for the reinforcements for the next lift, then just everybody got back in the aircraft, and we then picked up the next group of infantry and headed back in, knowing that we were going to encounter just what we had left before.
I mean, this was a bad place. This was not a safe place to be. However, we knew that it was our comrades, we knew that it was our countrymen on the ground, and swallowed, although our throats were probably pretty dry, and just went on in. It was not what I wanted to do. I can remember at one point thinking, gee whiz, if we weren't supporting Americans, I don't believe I'd do this.
A command and control helicopter flew 450 meters over the battlefield. Kitted out with a bank of radios, this Huey enabled commanding officers and support staff to observe their men from a safe distance. Artillery officer Dudley Tadamy traveled aboard a command and control helicopter above the Ia Drang Valley.
It was the brigade commander's airborne sedan that he could use to get to and from places. From the commander's perspective, it was a great thing to have. If you were a smaller unit commander, you might have been apprehensive about the fact that now your boss could drop in at any moment unannounced from out of nowhere to visit your location unannounced.
The situation at LZ X-ray was bleak. Huey crews were ordered back into the sky to relieve the beleaguered troops.
When we finally got the word to pick up ammunition and go back to LZ X-ray, the LZ was easy to find. There was a lot of smoke billowing from the LZ. As we got into trouble, you could hear people come on the radio.
Where in the hell are they at?
And you get a lot of screaming and hollering, and people were clearly in trouble. People were clearly frightened to death. It really turned your stomach.
Late in the afternoon, Moore's command post was in danger of being overrun. Huey crews dropped in reinforcements. Within seconds, they rushed to block an NVA thrust aimed at the exposed flank of the Americans. As enemy tracers raked across his command post, Hal Moore called in all the firepower at his disposal. Nearby were 2 artillery units. A-1E Sky Raiders joined the battle. This dive bomber, developed at the end of World War II, could loiter for hours, attacking targets with both 20mm cannon and more than 4,000 kilograms of bombs. The aerial rocket artillery helicopters were also ready to attack. They were loaded with 48 rockets and up to 8 machine guns. They resembled angry hornets, able to hover in close and strike with deadly accuracy.
Hotel 49, looks like they'll be landing down south of that dark spot on the finger. We'll try to aim towards the, just to the right of the finger as we go in.
People secured LC up there then.
36 in the air, negative. That chop is right over his head now.
So when they called in firepower, artillery, or ARA, it was in on us also. And I remember at least 1 or 2 times we had to pull back. And that was when we were making assaults across the creek bed, that we got out too far. And we were taking casualties, friendly casualties ourselves, from our own explosive, you know.
Without close artillery support, the Americans would not survive. Dudley Tadamy circled above the battlefield that day in a command and control helicopter. He listened as one captain radioed for help.
Words to the fact that if it isn't close enough where I can feel it going over, some of the shrapnel going over ain't close enough. When you get involved in hand-to-hand combat, you can expect that there will be some friendlies and opposing elements intermingle. And the bad feelings that you always end up with is whether or not whether or not your actions were responsible for the loss. And so you learn to adjust and live with that.
Had it not been for our air power, ARA, the Hueys, our Sky Raiders dropping bombs, tables could have been turned the other way. I might not be here today. I feel real strong about that too.
As darkness settled on the Yardrang Valley, the Huey crews shut down for the night. The men on the ground dug in and waited.
We had flares, illumination, dropping out of the sky, and it lit up the area very, very bright, like daylight. You could see every blade of grass. And I imagine the enemy could see us too. I don't know, but that's the way we felt. That we were spotlighted also. On a machine gun, every 5th round is a tracer. And at nighttime, you really don't want to fire your weapon if you don't have to, unless you're being directly assaulted, because you don't want to give away your position. Because tracers work both ways. They not only mark the target you're trying to hit, the enemy could see where it's coming from also, and they could pinpoint your location. We had the red tracers, they had the green and the orange tracers, the North Vietnamese. So if you saw green tracers coming at you, or orange ones, you knew it was the enemy. So you just fire from wherever they're coming from, you probably hit the target. You pretty much see when a North Vietnamese would be shot, because all of a sudden the orange or green tracers would shoot straight up in the sky. So, it would be a North Vietnamese would fall down with his finger on the trigger.
Day 2 began with a furious cacophony of bullets. Every man opened up his weapon on full automatic.
We got orders to just pick a spot wherever we were facing out from our perimeter and do a mad minute. It may have lasted 3 minutes, but just to clear your weapon and fire at anything that's out there. It might be sneaking up on you. So, and it worked. A few people fell out of trees, North Vietnamese.
Dawn on November the 15th. The conflict raged for a second day. For the soldier, it was yet another day in a violent combat with a persistent enemy. The Vietnamese attacked in waves, and the fighting continued at this ferocious pace all day and into a second night. By the morning of the 3rd day, the battle was finally over. The Viet Cong had withdrawn. The Americans policed the battlefield, collecting enemy weaponry and their own dead. On the American side, there were 79 killed and 121 wounded. North Vietnamese casualties were estimated to be higher. Thus, in military speak, it was declared a victory.
We policed that battlefield. We walked across enemy dead. We picked up their weapons. We survived. They quit the fight and retreated. I call that a victory, when you can walk across the enemy dead and pick up their weapons.
As always, the toll of victory is high. United Press reporter Joe Galloway rode into X-ray the first night. He describes the photographs he took.
I look at the faces. And I see basically how calm everyone is. There's no panic. There's almost, if anything, a resigned attitude. I look also and I see the feet, the boots, where they're wrapped in their poncho. Maybe the only thing you see are those 2 boots sticking out the end of it. And, that guy sat down last night or whenever and laced those boots up. And now he did.
The similarity between this modern-day encounter and Custer's last stand is striking. But this outcome is different. The fate which claimed George Armstrong Custer at Little Bighorn is averted by Hal Moore and his troopers.
I felt very proud of what my men had done. I felt very saddened at having lost so many men. And I felt guilty that I was still alive when so many of my men were dead.
The survivors from the 7th were pulled out of landing zone X-ray. Air mobility, with the help of massive American firepower, had withstood its first large-scale test.
The portion of the air mobile concept was definitely validated, but we did not use helicopters in X-ray to envelop the enemy in a flowing 3-day battle. We were in a perimeter, fighting off wave after wave of attacks by the enemy. We could not have succeeded in doing that had we not had air mobility in the form of Huey helicopters bringing us ammo and water. I think if we had attempted to destroy that enemy by simply groping and plodding our way through the jungles on the ground, we would have worn out our men, and they would have had the advantage. This is their turf. They knew it better than we did.
The next day, November the 17th, air mobility would again be tested. This time, the outcome was to raise the haunting memory of Custer once more.
The takeoff time for the first cell is 0500 local. Climb out on the standard departure route, level off at Point Bravo.
On the morning of November the 17th, B-52 pilots and crews prepared for their first tactical strike of the Vietnam War. Their mission was to bomb suspected enemy positions surrounding landing zone X-ray.
Point Delta, start climb to flight level 360. Open your bomb doors 30 seconds prior to release on X-ray 30.
The men who had replaced the 7th were in danger from friendly fire and needed to get out of range of the bombers.
I don't want anybody with their flak jacket or their steel pot off. Is that understood? Can anybody not hear that?
For reasons either lost to history or through poor command, the troopers of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry were ordered to walk out of X-ray. Their destination was landing zone Albany, 3.5 kilometers from X-ray, through enemy-held territory. They left any connection with air mobility behind. With no helicopters, no security, and no forward reconnaissance, the men marched out of X-ray in a column. After walking for 3 hours, the Americans stumbled upon the enemy. The 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry was ambushed in a furious and savage attack.
They took the Americans by surprise and strung out over 600 yards of jungle. They cut the column into pieces like you chop the head off a snake and then just segment it with a hoe. They were attacking through the column, cutting it into pieces, and except for defensible perimeters at the head and tail of this column, everybody else in the middle was fair game. And they were fighting and dying by 1s and 2s and 3s.
The confusion on the ground prevented those aboard a command and control Huey above the battlefield from helping the Americans below.
It was a very dense canopy, and all you could see were little streamers of smoke coming out of a lot of directions. And I remember somebody saying, get the artillery in, and where's the artillery? And I remember telling Colonel Brown that I couldn't do it now because we didn't know where anybody was at this particular point. And Bartholomew is making passes over the guys. Can you hear me now? I'm coming in. Tell me where you are from the sound of my rotor blades.
At nightfall, Huey crews were sent in to pull out the wounded and drop in reinforcements, some of whom had just fought at X-Ray.
By then, we were dog-tired, and there had been an awful lot of activity. And I can remember knowing that this place was very, very hot. I can remember the dry throat, and I was frightened to go.
Boss 36 is inform 1-1. 1 minute north. I have the tracer fire in sight. Over.
A firefight broke out in the LZ, and it looked like a laser show. The tracers were just lacing back and forth across the LZ itself. I truly don't know how the North Vietnamese gunners didn't lock onto our Hueys and do us a job.
For those on the ground, it went beyond hell.
The enemy were walking around shooting the wounded, shooting their prisoners, shooting anybody they found.
Total carnage. Bodies so closely mixed. Guys with bayonets, guys with their hands tied behind them. They'd been shot. It was probably the most horrifying experience that I've ever had. It convinced me that there was, and I think Larry Gwynn said this, there's no glory in war, there's only tragedy, and there's only death.
To prevent a massacre, U.S. artillery was called in virtually on top of the cavalrymen.
The enemy left. They had gone in and policed up most of their bodies, and they had taken some napalm, they had taken artillery, and they had lost a lot of casualties of their own, and they policed up what they could, and they left. And the fight was over. But as far as that being anything but luck, I don't know what it would be. They'd done what they set out to do, and they left.
The death toll for the Americans was 155. Only 3 days after the battle at X-Ray, the North Vietnamese had learned how to blunt the American advantage. Get in so close that technology is rendered useless.
They were afraid of what this new way of warfare was going to mean, what the helicopter was going to mean, and they wanted to blood their soldiers. They wanted to test their tactics against ours and find some way for a peasant army to deal with the highest tech army then operating in the world. They learned how the only way that they could survive under the firestorm was to get under that, get in, grab them by the belt buckle, and make them fight us one-on-one. Where the only firepower then that matters is hand grenade and rifle and bayonet. And then it doesn't matter how high-tech you are, it matters what's in your heart.
The battles in the Ia Drang Valley proved that a technological advantage does not guarantee victory. Though thousands of their soldiers perished at X-Ray, NVA commanders considered the battle a victory. In the end, they were willing to pay any price to expel the foreign invaders. But in 1965, US policymakers were unable or unwilling to recognize this. Instead, they too looked at X-Ray as a victory. Convinced that Americans and their firepower could win the war, the Johnson administration doubled the number of soldiers in Vietnam to 400,000. By 1966, 15,000 young Americans were arriving in Southeast Asia every month. Many would ride into battle on the UH-1 Huey. Once there, they would find themselves ensnared in a guerrilla war. A war of attrition. A war of body counts. For Huey pilot Bruce Crandall, the perceived success at X-ray prolonged the war for the Americans.
When you look back and you realize that if we had not fought that fight, that war might have been over sooner. The idea that the air-mobile concept was good and our politicians decided to continue the war, nobody told us to win it. And that's where, if we were going to expend that kind of resource, we certainly should have been trying to win.
For the actions in the Ia Drang Valley, the 1st of the 7th would be recommended for a Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit-level decoration awarded by the Army. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st of the 7th Cavalry fought and died in unprecedented numbers in the valleys in Vietnam. If it had not been for the work of Huey pilots and crews, the troopers would have known a similar fate that befell George Armstrong Custer at Little Bighorn.
I think Moore would be as famous as Custer, and the helicopters kept him from being that famous. And then I think if Custer had had a couple of my helicopters, we'd never heard of him either.
I knew that we would prevail. We had fire support in massive quantities, and I had a disciplined bunch of men. They were going to fight and fight hard and fight to the death.
The helicopters were the difference in the fact that he had to have ammo, and he had to get his wounded down.
A lot of my men only had 10 days left to serve in the Army when they went into this battle. And a lot of them came home in boxes. Not one of them backed up.